I have certain views about things which are not all of them conventional views, and so I suppose it helps people to think a little bit outside the box, but also contemplate possible changes in how physics might develop in the future, and maybe think outside the box themselves. You see, my father had a telescope that was sort of brass, long tube, and he took me outside, and I was looking at the moon and things like that, and then he showed me Saturn. So I looked at Saturn, and I thought, wow, that's, I've seen so many pictures of Saturn, but just to see it there as something real, I think that had a big impression on me, to see that the world out there, if you look at it in the right way, you can actually see these things which you may just see in books otherwise, but to experience something of the actual world, which is different. I've always been a very visual person, I think, and I think I studied mathematics as an undergraduate, and I was quite surprised. You see, when I first realized I was going to be with a lot of other when I was at school, I felt a little bit awkward about being a bit different because most people weren't interested in mathematics. And then I thought when I went to university I'd find people who were like me. When I got to university I found more different ways of thinking than I'd experienced before. But the main division I found was whether people thought visually or not. And it's quite surprising in a way that mathematicians don't very much. And it's quite, I've had experiences, people say, well, I'd like you to give a talk to the general public. Lots and lots of pictures, that's great, lots of pictures. Sure, but if you give a course in mathematics, they can find the pictures kind of, I don't know, it's not the way it's done so much. And I guess thinking a little bit differently from most people is helpful in a way, because then I can go on routes which other people haven't gone on. But of course you've got to be good at other things too, like being able to solve equations and so on. But I've found it useful at certain types of equations representing these with little diagrams too, and that I find much easier to manipulate things involving tensors, where you might have lots and lots of letters representing components and things, and then some of them are matched up with others, and you can do this by drawing pictures with these letters that are represented by pictograms sort of thing in various places, and then you join them up with lines all over the place. And the configuration of how those lines join up is a much more, I can find that much easier to grasp what's going on than just seeing which letter matches with which. That's sort of very difficult to do and keep track of. I don't think I have a favourite shape, no. They're all, well, some of them are more interesting than others. But I played around with things with five-fold symmetry, so that means pentagons and pentagonal stars and things like that. But I wouldn't say they're my favourite shapes particularly. No, I don't think I have a shape which is my favourite. There's some very intriguing configurations. One of the ones that I found very useful is a four-dimensional one. You see, these things called Clifford parallels. You have a sphere and circles drawn on the sphere, but the sphere has to be a sphere in 4 dimensions. It's not an ordinary sphere that you normally visualize. And in the sphere in 4 dimensions you have these circles which go around and they link each other and they make a very symmetrical pattern. But to get a picture of that you've got to project it into 3 dimensions, and these make very intriguing configurations. So that's one of my favorite configurations, if you like, or shapes, or whatever it is, yes. I think one of the things that always certainly struck me as a bit of magic, well, there's lots of bits of magic in equations, but at a level which is not too far from common experience, is the equation that if you e to the I theta equals cos theta plus I sine theta, and it has these cosines and sines which are very geometrical notions with triangles and so on, and this formula relates this exponential function to these trigonometric functions. And it makes formulae with the trigonometrical functions so much easier. I mean, you have complicated things with sines and cosines and all that, and they look a bit of a mess, and you've got to memorize them perhaps. But the easy one is with the exponential, and you can see everything is very, very simple. So I would say that's one of my favorite anyway. Well, it's not so much that they're unconventional. I find often in trying to understand something, to make sense of it, one has to I guess one of the main ones, I would say, which is to do with quantum mechanics. See, quantum mechanics, people keep saying, is the best theory we have, or something like that. I have trouble with this because although it's a theory which explains all sorts of things we didn't know how to understand before, usually small things, it has an inbuilt inconsistency in it, because quantum mechanics consists of two main features. One of them is how what you call the quantum state evolves. How does it change in time? And there's this famous equation due to Schrödinger, the Schrödinger equation, and that tells you how the quantum state changes in time. But then Schrödinger himself pointed out this huge puzzle with his equation, because it allows you to create a situation in which you could have a cat which was dead and alive at the same time. And he more or less presented that example to show that there's something wrong with that as a picture of the world. So he certainly was of the view that the following his equation is not a complete description of what goes on in the world. And it's not just that it's not a complete description, it's the description doesn't tell us what the world actually does. There's something else in the way you use quantum mechanics, and there's the other part of quantum mechanics, is what you do when you make a measurement. And making a measurement, it's always strange. What does that mean? I mean, you've got a device here which measures. Well, what is that? That's a device which is made out of the same things that everything else is made out of, particles and waves and so on. So how does a thing which is made out of quantum mechanics do something which the equation of Schrödinger doesn't tell you it does? So there's clearly something missing in the theory. Lots of people take the view, well, that what's missing is something in how you interpret the theory. If you interpret it right, then it all makes sense. Some people say, oh no, you've got to take it seriously, and it means that the cat is dead and alive at the same time, and it really is. And there's, and if you look at it, then there's two of you in a sense. One of you sees the live cat, and the other sees the dead cat, and you both coexist. And this is what's called the many worlds interpretation. And none of these do I feel happy with at all, because that's not what we experience in the world. And my attitude to this is that despite how wonderful quantum mechanics is, and it is wonderful, it's not right. There's something missing. It's not just there's something missing, that's slightly, you see, Einstein used to say that the theory is incomplete. I think that's a little too polite, you see. I mean, it's a very robust theory. You can be rude about it because we know it works so marvelously well. But it's not quite right. There's got to be something to correct the theory. That's the way I would view it. And that when you have these superpositions of one thing and another thing, say a particle being here and here, but if it's a baseball being here and here at the same time, that's not what you see. What happens? You put the baseball so it's here and here at the same time. It doesn't do that. It's here or here. So what is it that makes it be one or the other? And that's not the way that the rules of quantum mechanics that we understand them now, that's not what it tells us. So you have to change those rules. And I think the way you change those rules involves bringing the theory of quantum mechanics appropriately together with the theory of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which involves curved space-time and all sorts of other weird ideas. So they're different weird ideas from quantum mechanics. But I think bringing them together is going to mean a change in both theories. But it's somehow it's an uncommon view that you've got to change the quantum mechanics. People usually say, no, it's so good you've got to leave it alone. But I think, you know, it's some level it's got to have to be seriously modified. Well, it's an intriguing issue. I mean, should one be trying to argue against things which are hugely well established? Now, you see, the thing is where I think you're going to raise issues is there may be parts of theory which seem to be necessarily there, but are they that well established? You see, I was talking about quantum mechanics, but there is another thing which is accepted as part of cosmology, which you'll find in all the books, whether they're popular books or technical books. In the first very, very tiny fraction of a second, 10 to the minus 32 seconds roughly, think of 1 over a number with 32 digits. That fraction of a second, there was supposed to be this thing called inflation, which was a huge expansion and it went on within this tiny fraction of a second. And you have to cook up a special theory to make it work, and it doesn't really, in my view, work even then. But on the other hand, it's there for a purpose, and it's there for some purposes which you need something, which if you don't have the inflationary theory, you've got to replace it with something else. Well, you see here something which I think needs a replacement, and the view that's common among cosmologists is something which needs to be replaced by some other picture. And I have a sort of scheme about what sort of a picture that might be, and it's different from the conventional view. So if there's something which one might feel is in need of replacement or in need of change, in need of some modification because it's got some awkwardness, not just that it's strange. You see, quantum mechanics is strange, but there's a lot of these strange aspects of quantum mechanics are completely verified, and so when they're verified, fine, that's the way nature works, you've got to get used to it. But there's certain other aspects of it which are not just that. They don't seem to make sense in a more serious way. And in the case of inflationary model, I worry about things which don't seem to make sense, and one has to have a way of explaining in some other way the good things it does. So it does do things that we need a theory of some kind to explain, and that's the model that people have. But if it's not a satisfactory model, then we have to think of something else which instead would explain the same things which you need to explain. But I think questioning them is certainly good, even when it just as part of understanding. So it's a good thing to be suspicious of, say, quantum mechanics, and then it's a part of understanding the theory as it is and coming to terms with it. The questioning is important. It's hard to predict. It's either something, if I've had an idea, which is maybe the wrong time, you see, before I'm going to bed, and then I start wondering about, does it really work? Now that can keep you awake when that's not such a good idea. Now I say, okay, I'll think about that in the morning. No, it doesn't work, because if it's something which maybe you think of a different way of looking at something, does it work or doesn't it work? And it may not be obvious at first. I can't go to sleep and say, okay, I'll think about that in the morning. I have to look at it then and there. It may not come to a conclusion, of course. So I wear myself out and then go to sleep. How to make sense of the quantum world and how it relates to the way when big things, say massive things at least, seem to behave in a way which isn't in accordance with the rules which Cesare quantum. How do I understand that? Can you have a better theory which leads from these quantum non-localities and things like that to a world which looks like a classical world that we we understood before quantum mechanics came along? So that's one thing, and I certainly have been thinking about with people who are doing experiments, because they're colleagues of mine in Nottingham, Yvette Fuentes, who is originally Mexican, but she's working in Nottingham in England at the moment, and she has a group of people who are concerned with doing experiments with these things called Bose-Einstein condensates. These are very, very quantum mechanical things which have to be extremely cold, tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a degree above absolute zero, and they behave in very quantum mechanical ways, even though they're kind of macroscopic. And maybe you could use these devices to test the theories about what's called the collapse of the wave function. That's when the Schrödinger equation suddenly doesn't seem to work anymore. You make a choice between this and this rather than the two things coexisting. And that they look as though one might be able just to explore this boundary and maybe see evidence for the effects of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which could perhaps influence quantum mechanics. So that's one of the areas. The other area I guess I've been thinking about more, well, let's mention two others. One other area is this cosmology. I talked about inflation and say why I think something else has got to be in replacing it. But I've had a scheme for, I don't know, about a decade and a half, which says that the Big Bang, which is normally thought of as the beginning of the universe, and that there wasn't even meaning to say before the universe was there, before the Big Bang. But the view here is that there was something. I know that Neil Turok here has a view of this nature, which is a bit different from mine, but many things in common with it. But the perspective is that there was something going on before the Big Bang. And the model I have tells you that what was before, it's a little bit hard to grasp the ideas of this model, because you say there's the Big Bang, universe expanded, and with no inflation, though, it expanded, and then it went on, and then it started to expand with this, what's called exponential expansion, which is, people could talk about dark energy, and that's, I call it the cosmological constant. This is what Einstein introduced into his theory for the wrong reason in 1917, and then retracted it shortly after he introduced it. But it was a good thing he introduced it, because it seems to be there, which is quite a remarkable thing. But anyway, the idea is that in the very, very distant future, when this expansion takes place and everything gets rarefied and rarefied, there's not much left except black holes, and then those black holes start to evaporate away by Hawking evaporation. Takes, when I say millions and trillions and zillions of years, you have to wait something like, how many years? Well, a googol years, maybe even longer than that. What's a googol? Well, you think of one with 100 zeros, and that number of years, that sort of number of years, maybe even more for the really big ones. These black holes finally disappear, and then you've left with what I call the very boring era, nothing really going on. But the thing is that era you could think of physically equivalent to something almost like a Big Bang. Now, it's hard to get your mind around that, but in this picture, that becomes another Big Bang. So you have the sequence, Big Bang, remote expansion, and then somehow the universe forgets how big it is. It's something like that. Funny idea, but the model allows you to do that. That somehow, when there's nothing left but massless things, photons, whatever it is, running around, they don't know how big the universe is. And so big and small become equivalent, and it becomes like a Big Bang. And it explains things that, like the things that you might want inflation for. It explains other things. It has predictions. One of these things which I've been talking about here are things which I call Hawking points, because I talked about the black holes. Well, what about those black holes in the eon prior to ours? They hang around for a long time, then they evaporate away. And all that radiation which comes out gets sort of concentrated in one spot. And then you should see the effects of that one spot, which what you see when you look back in the universe is not quite the Big Bang. There's this thing called the microwave background. But that microwave background was created 380,000 years after the Big Bang. So what you see is 380,000 years after. Now the Hawking point, you see, is where this concentration of all the radiation that came out of that black hole spews itself out into this next eon, and it creates a region which is about 8 times the diameter of the moon. So I sort of think of that as a Hawking spot, you see. It's not a point, it spreads out. Now this is this weird idea, but we seem to see them. And we see them in different, there's what people call the Planck satellite, which looks at this radiation all around in the universe. An older one was called the WMAP satellite, and we see these spots in the same places in both of the data. And as far as I can see, they're really there. Really exciting to see whether they are really there, and are they exactly as this theory predicts. And if they are, how do you explain them with inflation? It's very hard to see, because the inflation sort of spreads everything out. It doesn't keep it restricted to the size that you would see with these spots. So I'd be keen to see what the proponents of inflation have to say about where these spots come from. There was one third, I don't know if you want me to talk.
Sure.
No, this is the thing which I've been playing around with for goodness knows how many decades, which is a thing I call twister theory. And twister theory is really another way of looking at physics. You see, when we think about space and time, we've got 3 dimensions of space, and we've got 1 dimension. Well, string theory adds a whole lot of other dimensions. I'm not going to do that. We have 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, so that's a 4-dimensional space-time. And then that's the sort of background of physics. Things go on in that. And the space-time is sort of made out of points. So the points are the smallest thing, and it's made out of points. So that's the normal picture. Well, unless you talk about things like quantum gravity, maybe those points are all got fuzzy or something. But that's not what I'm talking about. Now, just a completely new picture. You don't think of the points as the fundamental thing. You think more like light rays. So you think like a particle moving with the speed of light. So think of it as like a photon or something. I'm not talking about quantum mechanics. It's like a particle moving the speed of light. And the entire history of that thing moving the speed of light, that's what I call a light ray. And instead of thinking of the point as basic, you think of that as basic. And that's a different space, and then it's got a kind of twist to it when you think of these angular momentum of the photon and all the spin of the photon and the polarization of it. That's what I should be talking about. Anyway, that photons can twist one way or the other, you see, and so you've got, has to be incorporated into it. And then you have a space with a very nice mathematical structure, and then the idea is you say that is the fundamental thing. The space-time we experience is a secondary thing. You derive it from that. And it gives you a different outlook on so many things in physics. Sometimes it's simpler, sometimes it's more complicated. Sometimes it's very difficult to get, and I've been struggling with how you represent Einstein's general relativity theory. I think I know how to do it now, but it's been taken many decades to see how to represent that theory in terms of this other picture. It's called a twister because the photon, if you like, it's got a kind of twist to it at the same time. And that's the angular momentum of the photon. But it's just a different way of looking at physics. And it leads you into all sorts of intriguing kinds of mathematics. And many of the, in fact, I think probably there's more in this area which is just mathematics, which people do for fun, you see, not necessarily physics. But it's sort of come into its own a bit more recently in terms of scatterings of high-energy particles. But I think there are other routes that one might follow where it has bearing on such things as cosmology and maybe the collapse of the wave function thing, and maybe particle physics, maybe. It just gives you a different point of view. And that point of view, certainly one I find intriguing and exciting and very interesting geometrical ideas connected with it, so I find it fun too. Well, it's essential. I mean, what experiments are you doing? I mean, you don't just go and do any other experiment. You want to do an experiment which tests something about the theory. And the theory guides which experiments you design. And of course, what the experiment does, if it's a good experiment, and certainly if it comes out the way you didn't expect, that tells you to change your theory. And I think it's vital, although I spent much of my time playing around with, as I say, twisters, which are done for the sake of just making the framework of physics look from a different angle, looked at from a different angle. It doesn't, at least initially, make predictions which are different from conventional predictions. But the aim is that it would do eventually, once one knows how the theory works. But in general, I think you've got to have, there's no point in having theories floating around if they're not going to be testable by experiment. In the case of twistor theory, it's not really like that because it's mainly a reformulation of existing theory, and so long as it's that, it's useful to use. It's not a theory, a different theory in the sense of different physics. But that the hope is that it would be. And there are ways you can see natural ways in which this theory could be developed and give you different physics. But that's not happened as yet. It's obviously a difficult question, because if I'm asked, what interested me, and I say what interested me and what got me fired up and what so on, but that could be quite different for somebody else. And I certainly, as I said, I think before with mathematics, people think in different ways, and to give a general piece of advice about how you should think about things is probably not a good idea. But what I would say is do what you find exciting, and do what you find beautiful, and or do what suits you, your own way of thinking. And so it might not be my advice to myself. So if I say what I find useful to think about, might not be the right advice for somebody else, because people do think in different ways. So I think the general comment I would make is simply do what you find exciting in the physics, what you find fascinating. And that can be, but it may even be just going off into a not very physical area, very much a pure mathematical direction. That's fine too. But if it's going to be physics, there's a lot of exciting things in physics, and many of the weird things going on which are true in physics. Those are things to pay attention to and to talk about and think about, and I guess that's the best I can do.